Welcome to the Thriving Ministry with Young Adults, Holy Yearnings, Holy Listening, Holy Partnerships webinar series. Today is the second webinar in this series, and we are talking about how justice evangelizes and brunch heals, finding our way to young adults through social action and spiritual practice. The voice that you hear is Martha Rudy, and I serve as the Connectional Learning Coordinator here at Garrett-Evangelical. I will be the off-screen moderator for this webinar series. And during this webinar, you will be in view and listen mode. If you experience technical difficulties or if you have questions for our presenters, please type them into the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. You can send questions at any time during the presentation, and they will be answered during the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. If we're unable to answer any questions during the webinar, we will ensure that the presenters get the questions, and we'll get all your responses back to you via email. This webinar is being recorded. The list of participants is private, and when I ask your questions aloud, I will not identify you by name. We'll send you an email with a link to view this webinar recording within 72 hours. There'll be a time in the middle of the webinar where we'll ask for a chat time, and at that point, you will be able to use the chat feature at the bottom of your screen. So without further ado, I would like to present Dr. Dory Baker and Professor Gina Robinson as they share with you how justice evangelizes and brunch heals.
Hi, I'm Dory.
Hi, I'm Gina.
So we are part of the Holy Listening, Holy Yearnings, Holy Partnerships team. This is a project at Garrett-Evangelical. As you probably know by now, we are funded by the Lilly Endowment to address one of the biggest challenges churches face today, reaching young adults in meaningful ways. This multi-phase project aims to help congregations create innovative ministries to support young adult flourishing through a hub, which is housed at Garrett-Evangelical Theological Seminary. In the webinar that follows, Gina and I will discuss two themes that surfaced as we listened deeply to young adults. We hope this will inspire you and your congregation to think about and to imagine and to create innovative ministries to support young adult flourishing in your context. So the two themes that we'll be exploring are justice evangelizes and brunch heals. And in the webinar that follows, we'll begin by reviewing Maria Harris's idea of a curriculum or a race that the church runs, that all that the church does teaches. We'll look closely at these two themes, justice and spiritual practice. We'll pause along the way to do some holy listening to each other, really to ourselves through journaling and through the chat. And we'll conclude by sharing our hunches about the innovations that we are working with among young adults, and then have some Q&A with you about how these stories might speak to or inspire your context. But we're going to start, as Gina and I like to do, with giving our souls a chance to catch up with our bodies. We've been hurtling through time and space to arrive here, and here we are. So we're going to begin by centering with Gina.
Thank you, Dory. Identifying and voicing our holy yearnings can seem like a daunting task when given the opportunity to engage in holy listening, because our mind, body, and soul might move at an unrelenting pace in an attempt to keep up with the busyness of life's demand. When this is our reality, mystic theologian Howard Thurman calls us to a special place, our inward sea. Thurman says, there is in every person an inward sea. In the sea, there is an island, and on that island, there is an altar, and standing guard before that altar is the angel with a flaming sword. Nothing can get by that angel to be placed upon that altar unless it has a mark of your inner authority. Nothing passes the angel with the flaming sword to be placed upon that altar unless it be a part of the fluid area of your consent. I believe the way we escape the busyness of our life is to retreat to the island in our inward sea by taking the advice of Howard Thurman to heart. We must center down. So hear the words of Howard Thurman. It reads, "How good it is to center down, to sit quietly and see oneself pass by. The streets of our minds seethe with endless traffic. Our spirits resound with clashings, with noisy silences, while something deep within hungers and thirsts for the still moment and the resting lull. A direction, a strong, sure purpose that will structure our confusion and bring meaning in our chaos. We look at ourselves in this waiting moment, the kinds of people we are. The questions persist. What are we doing with our lives? What are the motives that order our days? What is the end of our doings? Where are we trying to go? What do we put the emphasis, and where are our values focused? For what end do we make sacrifices? Where is my treasure, and what do I love most in life? What do I hate most in life? And to what am I true? Over and over, the questions beat in upon the waiting moment. As we listen, floating up through all of the jangling echoes of our turbulence, there is a sound of another kind, a deeper note, which only the stillness of the heart makes clear. It moves directly to the core of our being. Our questions are answered, our spirits refreshed, and we move back into the traffic of our daily round with the peace of the eternal in our step. How good it is to center down. Today, you will learn about millennials, including myself, who seek to live out the answer to Thurman's prolific question, to what are you true? Together, we will discuss how holy listening enabled us to practically engage the holy yearnings of people around us. As we go forward in our conversation, let the words of our mouth, the meditation of our heart, be acceptable in thy sight. O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen and Ashe. Back to you, Dory.
Thanks, Gina. We can advance the slide.
It's coming.
Okay, great. While it's coming, I just want to take a moment to introduce myself and how I come to this work, and then Gina will have the opportunity to do the same. So I spend most of my time working with the Forum for Theological Exploration, which is a leadership incubator for the church located in Atlanta, Georgia. At FTE, we nurture the next generation of leaders for the church across all denominations in North America, and we also nurture the next generation of scholars of color for the academy, for the Theological Teaching Academy. So I got here by way of an MDiv at Garrett-Evangelical, where I served and was ordained a United Methodist and went out to serve a church in the suburbs of Chicago. And what I learned very quickly in serving that church was that there was a dearth of resources to help me translate the most exciting things I learned about in seminary to the people in the pews. The most exciting things I learned about in seminary were the emancipatory theologies that were bubbling up largely in the Southern Hemisphere and among people of color in North America in the late 80s and early 90s. I would name those womanist theology, which you'll hear more about from Gina, mujerista theology, which is theology that comes out of the lived experiences of Latinx women, and Asian feminist theologies. Putting those alongside white feminist theologies had been a real watershed moment for me during my Master's of Divinity. And I got out and started serving a church and didn't find any resources to help me even let people know that those theologies were available for us. So I went back and did a PhD at Garrett, and I focused particularly on the lives of young women and how these theological voices could interact with the lives of young women and help them do theology out of their own lives. The work, which became my first book, Doing Girlfriend Theology, at first focused a lot on constructing new images for God, but then it led me to the question of, so what? If you have a radical new image of God as mother, or God as friend, or God as the one who weeps with us, rather than the patriarchal images we may have inherited from our religious traditions. So if you have this radically different vision of who God is, what difference does it make in your life? And that turned me to the question of vocation. What difference does it make? How do we live our lives differently because of who God is? And that brought me to this work around young adults. When Garrett asked me to come on as the research director for the Holy Yearnings, Holy Longings process, I said yes, and I will add holy listening, because fundamental to my methodology is the belief that theology begins in the lived experiences of human beings. And so we centered a lot of this research on holy listening, which is a direct outgrowth of my research and work for almost 30 years now. So that's a little bit about me. And now I'll ask Gina. Gina, tell us how you came to be part of this project.
Sure. Thank you, Dory. Again, my name is Gina A.S. Robinson, and I am a native of Georgia, but I currently live in Evanston, Illinois. I am not yet a professor, as I was introduced earlier. I am actually a third-year doctoral student here at Garrett-Evangelical Theological Seminary, and I am a proud millennial womanist. I have the opportunity to serve youth and young adults in Aurora, Illinois at St. John AME, a Cathedral of Grace Church. And I came to this project as a student. I came as a research assistant to the director of the project, and I had an opportunity to see how this particular grant and project was engaging young adults. From the beginning to the end, listening to the holy yearnings of the people who were interviewed, and then also engaging with the congregations. I had the opportunity to be a part of one of the congregations, one of the innovation teams, and I had the chance to plan an event for young adults in which we focused on leadership, but particularly servant leadership. And we collaborated with the Kellogg School of Management here on the campus of Northwestern, and we had a great time. We interviewed an author, Nicholas Pierce, in his new book, and we talked about servant leadership. So that's kind of how I came to this work, and now I get to serve on this webinar.
Great. So we'll have the next slide, please. So I want to remind you all that this project began with these 10 wonderful young adults who we called congregational fellows. They came from congregations across the Chicagoland area, and as you can see, they were racially, gender, and ethnically diverse. They were all between the ages of 23 and 28. We hired them. Yes, we paid them, and we trained them to be holy listeners. We developed an interview protocol, and then we sent them out to interview their peers about their peers' spiritual yearnings. We asked questions like, what do you long for? How are you currently getting those yearnings met? What do you wish the church would provide that it doesn't? And lots of stories surface. Stories about how the church had been harmful at times, stories about their childhood in the church, which had been very welcoming, stories about how their Christian faith had been formed in Sunday school, but then once they got through confirmation, they drifted away. A lot of stories. We then brought the fellows back together to hear what they heard and to discern the themes that had emerged over 30 interviews. So this is not a massive study. It's not a study with a big N. It's not a statistically quantitative study. It's called qualitative research, and it doesn't try to make any grand claims. It just tries to reflect honestly and accurately what we heard when we dove in deep with a group of people. So based on what they heard in holy listening, listening to the young adults based on the themes that surfaced, these congregations went on to design an innovative ministry. So they weren't designing out of their heads based on what they thought young adults might need, but they were designing out of these complex stories and themes. So later on in the webinar, I will share with you what I mean more carefully by holy listening. And the handout for today is a very simple to follow, easy immersion into holy listening. And I'll welcome at the end of the conversation some give and take about how you might use this exercise. It's different from the interview protocol we set up. It's just a first step towards being the kind of congregation that listens to young adults. So as we processed these complex stories, we came up with 7 themes and we had an aha moment. The aha moment was this. We can back up just one more minute for me, please. Thank you. Clearly, fixing what's broken as it relates to young adults in the church is deeply entangled with cultural shifts, personal stories, and institutional patterns. However, amidst all the complexity, we had an aha moment. And the aha moment was, you can give me the next slide now, Martha, thank you, was that the themes that we heard surfacing among the young adults echo what the church has always been about. We realized that most of the holy yearnings of the young adults we listened to correspond to the ancient first century church as it was described in Acts 2, verses 42 and 45 through 47. Now that scripture passage will become very important, and I urge you to look it up and read it later on in the day. Acts 2, 42, 45 through 47. And let me advance the next slide. The long and the short of that work is that everything the church does teaches, and that the things that the church does can be seen through these 5 lenses. We're using the work of a prolific religious educator by the name of Maria Harris, who was an advocate for approaches to religious education that reflect concerns for justice, that center justice, beauty, and the centrality of spirituality. So as you hear, what we're gonna say through these 5 lenses, be thinking about those 3 things: emphasis on justice, beauty, and the centrality of spirituality. So Harris envisioned a holistic approach to education, which replaced sort of the thinking of education happening in a classroom, in a school type setting. She blows it out to say that everything the church does teaches. And as she investigated that chapter in Acts, 2nd chapter, verses 42 and 45 through 47, she found the church doing these 5 things. And she insists that the church itself is a curriculum. And we are then led to ask the question that everything we do or do not do teaches about the God we say we worship. So we're going to take each of these one by one and define what they are through Maria Harris's lens of justice, and then we'll move back into the themes that we surfaced in our research. So the first of these, koinonia, and I'll fly through these because you have these on a handout from last week. So I'm just going to give a flyover so we kind of have the general context set. The first is koinonia. The church does community. Y'all probably have koinonia churches in your congregation. Through Maria Harris's lens, though, koinonia is not just getting together with people who look like us and who agree with us. In her lens, koinonia is building community towards the healing and wholeness of all of creation. This includes healing of divisions between human beings, between the earth and its creatures, and it involves a deep, abiding respect for other religions. Guess what? Young adults long for that kind of community. The second one, liturgia, which we know as liturgy, the work of the people. When most of us think of liturgy, we think of what happens during our official worship on Sunday morning. Maria Harris blows this out to call liturgy not just the public communal sacramental prayer of the people gathered, but also all of the spiritual experiences of the individual, such as contemplation, meditation, writing poetry, dancing, listening. I'm riffing on her here, taking her a step further, listening to your Spotify playlist. All of this can be included in the understanding of liturgy. The aim of liturgy is connection with the holy. Guess what? Young adults yearn for that. Thirdly, diaconia. Now, diaconia typically means ministry and service. It's where we get the word deacon from. For Harris, the diaconate is engaging in acts of solidarity growing out of compassion. When we do so, we enter into troublemaking. Acts of charity and service lead us into acts of solidarity, which cause us to question the very systems, right, that are embedded in our world that cause disparity of wealth and disunity among people. So she talks about diaconia as afflicting people with discomfort, creating confusion and chaos, inconveniencing and bothering institutions and systems of power and authority. And I like to say, when she focuses on diaconia, think Jesus, the way Jesus turned the table, the way Jesus asked difficult questions of the religious authorities of his day. This requires offering critique of popular culture, as well as looking closely enough at popular culture to see what is indeed good there. Guess what? Young adults are hungry for ways to look carefully at their culture, the culture they're creating, and decide, is Kanye West doing church on Sunday? Is that really church? How is Chance the Rapper leading us in a musical event that feels like church? Asking those kinds of questions of popular culture is something young adults are already doing. Okay, we have two more, and I'm going to fly through them quickly. Kerygma is the word. Traditionally, this means preaching. But in Maria Harris's lens, she thinks about the way we incarnate the word. She portrays it as the message of Christ's life fleshed out in our human activity. Kerygma includes not just preaching, but also acts of justice and advocacy for the oppressed. As Christians speak the word for others, we take seriously the cry for more equitable distribution of food, clothing, shelter, power, socioeconomic realities among our global community of neighbors. Guess what? Young adults are hungry for that kind of incarnation of God's being in the world. They see these injustices and they're eager to address them. Lastly, didache, which is the root of the word didactic, which means teaching. Harris defines teaching as the whole church teaching the whole church. She reminds us that genuine teaching is often provocative, frightening, or risky. I wonder, have you ever been in an educational moment that was frightening or risky? I can name a lot of them. When we enter in with vulnerability to a place in which we're new, to a place where we haven't been shaped and formed, that kind of place can be a very risky place. This reminds me of a sign that used to hang outside of a church that I attended while I was in seminary. The sign read, "The sign of God is that we are led where we did not plan to go." Didache leads us to places that we did not plan to go. And guess what? Young adults are longing for spaces to learn how to align their lives with something larger than themselves. They yearn for companions to help them on the road to answering life's biggest questions. Who am I? What are my gifts? And what am I here for? Those big questions of purpose. In our ongoing research, we're holding these 5 essential acts of the early church up to what young adults are saying to us, wondering, what's missing here? What are they saying that's not on this list? And how does this list help us see what it is they are saying? So one of the themes that emerged, as I previously said, was justice evangelizes. So we can have the next slide finally. Y'all had to look at that one for a long time. So what do we mean by this? Justice evangelizes. Congregations struggling to interpret the gospel through the lens of contemporary social justice issues such as racism, mass incarceration, sexual orientation, and gender identity justice, poverty, and climate change. Churches that were struggling and grappling publicly with these issues were attracted to the young adults in our study. The people we listened to said They want to be involved in churches where they can find like-minded sojourners committed to enacting their faith by working for the betterment of the world. Now, that might not happen in every congregation to every group of young adults that you visit, but the ones that we sat with told us this. Participants said, I'm going to read you just 3 quick quotes from our participants that reflect this theme, justice evangelizes. Gail, a 25-year-old white woman, said, "The pastors and others we have here help me see that justice for all people is part of our mission as people of faith. People who are Christians must be loving, and we must not just talk about these issues, but actually put them into action." A second quote came from a Black man named Jeff, who said, "The job description for worship leader here actually had things about the community being LGBTQ inclusive and anti-racist." And I was like, wow, this is kind of awesome. Now I find myself in a community where I can go out and be supported and know my church is fully behind what I'm doing on Gay Pride Day or in a Black Lives Matters rally. And he actually described the day when he was out on a Black Lives Matters rally in Chicago, and he looked up and he saw members of his church holding a banner. And he was just awash in the feeling that he had found a spiritual home. Lastly, Randy, a 25-year-old white man, said, "I was looking for a place to have the courage to do what I wouldn't do otherwise, to make decisions based on what I think my impact on the world could be." So I close out this by saying, I just want to quote Gustavo Gutierrez, one of those liberation theologians I read when I was in seminary. He wrote a book called We Drink from Our Own Wells. And on page 44, he says, "There is no authentic evangelization that is not accompanied by actions on behalf of the poor." So in a minute, Gina's going to launch into what this looks like in a congregation, but I want to give you 2 quick stories. We can have the next slide now, Martha. So I live in Lynchburg, Virginia, which is the home of Liberty University and the home of the religious right. And most of the churches in that area are not open and affirming. This church, which is near my home, felt very impacted by the tragic massacre at the Pulse nightclub in 2016 in Orlando, Florida. And then they hung this sign. They went out and got this flag and they hung it outside their church. And they did so because they had been the first church in Lynchburg to become openly affirming of LGBTQ people back in the 80s. That had been a long part of their DNA and a part of their struggle and a part of their journey to do the theological work of getting people from point A to where they were. So it was a natural response for them to hang this flag. And what happened in the weeks and months to come, do you want to guess? Young people found them. People drove by, they saw that flag, and they said, "Hey, this church might be worth my time." They too were hurting from the trauma of the ripple effect of the trauma of those 49 people whose lives were lost in that massacre. So now, 2, 3, 4 years later, First Christian Church in Lynchburg, Virginia, has a good number of young adults in their choir because people stuck around. They realized this was a place that they could bring the pain point of their life and have it lifted up in community. So this is just an example of how justice evangelizes out of the strong DNA of a congregation. And when I think of this story, I think of charisma from the Harris framework. I think this church was living out the word as they interpreted it through their lens, through their lived reality. And indeed, they are evangelizing as they live that out in this example. All of this brings to mind the quote that's attributed to St. Francis. If we can have the next slide, please. "Preach the gospel at all times, and when necessary, use words." Charisma is lived out through our actions. So at this point, I get to stop talking and you get to hear from my colleague, Gina, who is embodying this idea with girls in a congregation outside of Chicago. Gina?
Thank you, Dory,
I
for
just
sharing.
forgot that we were supposed to take time to journal here. Sorry. First of all, we're going to journal, and then we get to hear from Gina. So here's what we want you to think about as you journal. And hopefully some of what you journal might make it into our questions and conversation at the end of our time together. So in your journal, can you reflect about a time when you experienced justice evangelizing in your congregation or in a congregation you knew as a teenager or as a young adult? Tell a story about a time when you experienced justice evangelizing. I'm going to set my timer and we're going to write for 2 minutes and then we'll come back together. How's that sound? So we're at about 1.5 minutes, and it occurs to me that you might need to journal about a time when when a church could have moved into its charisma and embodied justice and it didn't. And I also want to remind you all that the chat is there. So if you wanted to do a little bit of your journaling there and share a story with others, I think that would be okay. I would encourage that. Don't you all chat at once.
There is a chat button at the bottom of your screen next to the Q&A button. So feel free to click on that and start typing if you want to chat.
I just tested it out. It really does work. So I'm going to stop now and encourage you all to think about that more later. We don't want there to be too much dead time. We want to make sure we don't lose anybody. It's easy to get distracted, I know. So we are now going to transition to hearing from Gina about the justice work, the way that justice and community is living itself out in a congregation that she knows well.
Thank you so much, Dory. I too have a question for you all, but this is a question of reflection. And that question is, how are you understanding the role of the church in advocating for justice in the communities surrounding you? You can have the next slide, please, Martha. Yes, so I'm presenting on curating and cultivating community. And again, I'll ask that question. How are you understanding the role of the church in advocating for justice in the community or communities surrounding you? So this is a question that I have been wrestling with since 2012 when I first started serving as a youth volunteer at my church back in Atlanta. And it was after the murder of Trayvon Martin that my former church took a break from business as usual to discuss what happened in this particular community so that we may begin to think about the implications it has on communities around us and particularly our own community. In our youth service, the youth pastors decided we were going to put the sermon aside, and we were just going to have an open discussion in which our middle and high school students could ask questions about this injustice that has happened and the other injustices that were happening at the same time. And what I noticed as a volunteer was that the conversation, much of the attention of the conversation went to addressing the concerns of Black boys in the room, and that in turn marginalized the concerns and experiences of Black girls who were also in that room. And honestly, in that moment, that's when I knew that my call to seminary was solidified. I felt called to go to seminary so that I can then learn how to engage teenagers and youth on a deeper level when it comes to their relationship with God and understanding how God is acting in this world. So while my overarching research interest looks at the ways in which youth ministries and churches can hold Jesus and justice together at the center of their ministry, my passion project is curating and cultivating spaces for Black girls to survive and thrive. So engaging the work of Maria Harris as a researcher and as a practitioner has been very, very helpful for me. And it has been critical it has helped me to think critically rather about how I can hold justice and community intention as I commit to thinking through the original question that I posed to you all, which was how can I advocate for justice in this particular community? So Harris suggests that there are 3 activities demanded of a community that includes charisma in its curriculum. And those 3 activities are priestly listening, prophetic speech, and political advocacy. Again, those 3 activities are priestly listening, prophetic speech, and political advocacy. So Harris states, and I quote, "If the word continues to be sent forth to water and nourish the earth, we need, as a fashioned people, to cultivate the receptivity and responsiveness that characterize genuine listening." While Harris suggests priestly listening occurs by quieting oneself to listen to the voice of creation, I have learned through this project of the Young Adult Initiative that we cannot advocate for justice in our communities without engaging in holy listening with people who are in those communities. So by combining the priestly listening with the holy listening, I learned that the teens in my congregation that I am serving currently were facing microaggressions at their predominantly white schools and did not know what to do about it. For some of the girls, respectfully standing up for themselves was a risk they were unwilling to take because they feared that people would stereotype them based on many of the pervading stereotypes that are inflicted or enforced upon Black women and Black girls. So after learning about these experiences in the church, I decided to do more research to devise a practical response. So this gets at my research as a doctoral student. And one of the central questions for my research as a doctoral student for my dissertation is, how does the Black church support young Black women dealing with microaggressions? And thus far, here are a few things that I have observed. So on the next slide, you will see, I have observed that many Black churches have adopted a model of ministry that segregates the congregation based on age. So enter in youth ministry. We have our own youth service that operates simultaneously with the adult service. And ideally, this should foster opportunities to hold rich discussions at the intersections of race, gender, age, sexuality, class, and faith. That's ideal. However, there seems to be an emphasis on the struggles of Black boys and men through the preaching moment, the teaching moment, and even in discussion time. And these experiences, or the experiences of Black girls, can be rendered invisible in these moments. So that leads to my concerns. On the next slide, you will see one of my concerns listed, but first, one of my concerns is that youth leaders are not providing enough prophetic speech and political advocacy for young Black women. So then it goes back to that curriculum of the church with regard to charisma, having the prophetic speech and the political advocacy working together. I also am concerned that microaggressions will negatively affect the emotional and spiritual well-being of Black girls. Lastly, one of my major concerns is that young Black women's image of God will be distorted. So, what are some of my hunches when it comes to what can or what may be happening or what will happen in the future? I am thinking that Black girls are engaging multiple resources to nurture their emotional and spiritual well being. They are doing that right now. So, whether it's through social media, engaging different social platforms, or they're part of social clubs such as Girl Scouts or Debutantes or Jack and Jill, which is well known throughout the African American community. And some of them are even engaging in summer programs such as Freedom Schools that really do nurture and nourish them. And it just leads me to question, like, what are the ways in which the church is supporting them as well, or coming alongside these different resources to support them in the ways that they need to be supported as well. I also have a hunch that millennial womanists like myself will curate and cultivate the spaces that Black girls yearn for, and they yearn to experience freedom in. So I believe that many of my colleagues and myself are doing the work to create these spaces in which this type of justice can live and these girls can become free. And lastly, I will introduce some of my hopes. Some of the hopes that will come out of my work and the work of my other millennial womanist colleagues. And I really do hope that young Black women will view faith and spirituality as vital resources when facing microaggressions. I also believe that Black girls will develop practical and spiritual tools to deal with the microaggressions they face on a daily basis. And I just want to conclude by sharing how being a participant on so many different levels of the Thriving in Ministry with Young Adults, Holy Yearnings, Holy Listening, and Holy Partnerships project has inspired me to continue my work as a burgeoning professor, scholar, practitioner. I have learned, and now I know, I thought it before, but now I know that I can create and cultivate spaces where Black girls can be free. What gives me this reassurance? It was the fact that I was able to connect with other young adults, other millennials who were doing what Reverend Dr. Katie Geneva Cannon has called us to do. She's a womanist theologian who has gone to be with the ancestors. She called us to do the work our souls must have. And we have been doing that work by embodying and enacting what we imagine the world to be, how we imagine the justice-filled world to come into being through our active faith and our actions within or outside of the church. So I too have a question for us to journal about and to think about. And it's an opportunity to tell another story. So you can engage the chat feature, or you can write it down in your personal notes and we can hear about it in the question and answer section. So that question is, or the prompt rather, is tell a story about a time in your experience or throughout the church's history in which you have experienced a faith community creating a solution to a pain point in the world. Dory talked about some of these pain points that occur. For example, the Pulse nightclub massacre. That was a pain point. So tell a story about a time in your own experience or throughout Christian history when you experienced a faith community creating a solution to a pain point in the world. And we'll leave about a minute for us to kind of think through it and to type out or to write out our responses to that question.
So I'm going to pick up here. Do you think that's been enough time? Great, Gina. I'm just going to read one of the, in case y'all don't have your chat feature on, just going to read out loud what we see there, which is someone saying that they think about faith communities participating in the sanctuary movement and opening up their buildings, sharing resources, and creating welcome for those who are undocumented and facing deportation. Thank you for that comment. That's a really rich example, and that's been going on for decades. The sanctuary movement, I first learned about it when I was in seminary in Evanston 30 years ago. So what we're seeing now around immigration reform and churches really enacting the gospel by putting their lives on the line sometimes as sanctuary to folks who are undocumented. Thank you for that example. And thank you, Gina, for lifting up that phrase from one of my mentors, Katie Cannon, doing the work our souls must have. I think that this question of how we respond to the pain points in the world through our faith communities is a question about vocation. And doing the work our souls must have is about living out our call, living out our vocation as individuals and as communities. So I just want to lift that up as we segue into the second theme, which we heard our participants lifting up, which is that they, again and again, say that they are looking for meaningful spiritual practices. They are looking for and creating, with the stuff of their own lives, forms of prayer and ritual that fit their lifestyles, needs, schedules, and preferences. They are interacting with prayer as a way to encounter the world and as a tool for managing the overwhelming stress and anxiety that we keep hearing about in young people's lives, the epidemic of mental health issues, the epidemic of anxiety. And as we just heard from Gina, they are finding resources in a lot of different places for their own resilience amid the daily assaults for persons, especially those living in marginalized communities. So one of those ancient spiritual practices that young adults are telling us about, or that they're reinventing for today, is the spiritual practice of breaking bread together. That was one of those things in Acts 2 that the early church did. They broke bread together. Well, have you heard of brunch culture? One of the prototypes in the south side of Chicago is called Brunch with Destiny. Destiny is the name of a church, and they're doing a play on words. It's not Brush with Destiny, as in the famous film, but it's Brunch with Destiny. It creates monthly brunches for Black millennials who are already quite attuned to getting together with friends for brunch on Saturday or Sunday. So I interviewed someone who's very immersed in a brunch faith community that sprung up, and his name is Teddy, and he said, it's Saturday, and me and my wife and about 25 friends are around the table. It was supposed to be from 12 to 2. Friends are catching up. Now, all of a sudden, it's 5 o'clock, and we're not looking to move. There are still 12 to 15 of us sitting around the table. We're ordering dinner. Now, he said a majority of our friends are religious, and many of them are rooted in Christian practice, although many of them do not already go to church or do not always go to church now. At this point, he says, we're ordering dinner. And I said, y'all, we have gone to church. We've just had church. Teddy went on to say, we talked about life, we talked about finances, we talked about our student loan debts, we talked about the Black church, the good, the bad, and the historical contemporary issues, women's issues. We talked about politics, gender issues, LGBTQ issues affecting ourselves and our friends. All of these issues came up. And what I realized is the meal created an atmosphere for authenticity and transparency. As a Christian, that's what happens for me, Teddy said, at the table. That's what happens at communion. So what Teddy was saying was, as he had brunch with his friends, and this one had kind of bubbled up spontaneously, he looked around as a person who's trained with a Master's of Divinity, and he could see that the elements of the liturgy had taken place as they had met around the table. He said, we had reflected, we had broken bread, over several mimosas and some wine, the word had gone forth. So now that might be tricky for some of us. Some of us come from traditions where alcohol is not part of our communion table, but some of us also know that Jesus turned water into wine at the wedding, his first miracle, right? So what these young adults in this story are saying is, you can honor and bless, the church can honor and bless the way we are naturally getting together, and the church can become part of what culture is already doing to help heal the rift in community that is the result of very busy lives, very mobile lives, lots of moving around after college, before college, for jobs, etc. The story of brunch becoming church is being replicated by churches creating brunch, as I mentioned, in these prototypes in Chicago. And what I keep wanting to ask some of the churches, and the one church in particular in Chicago, I'm pushing them to ask their pastor, now, does it count as church that we have brunch together, or do we have to go to brunch together after church or before church? When does church actually move into and become explicitly named as happening in these places that are not in the brick and mortar walls of the church? So I want to move on as we move towards the end of the delivery of our lecture and more towards conversation with you. I just want to emphasize a few of the hunches that we are seeing. So as we said, our Holy Listening turned up lots of complex stories about the lives of young people and how church in North America is changing based on their preferences, their needs, their desires. The hunches arising from these stories and the hunches that are arising from the prototypes of the churches in our project are leading us to this. Two hunches that Gina and I saw as we looked at the data. When innovations arise out of necessity or survival, they have more of a likelihood of sticking around. So this is a complete flip of sitting around and saying, what can we do to bring young adults to church? And instead saying, where are young adults in need of help in their surviving and their thriving and their flourishing? What are they already doing, and how can we bring the resources of the church, the human resources, the financial resources, the spiritual resources, to these places that are already arising out of necessity and survival of young people? And secondly, when the innovations arise out of the particular DNA of a community, for example, a deep affinity with a cause, be it the Central American sanctuary movement of the 1980s or the current immigration reform movement, be it a civil rights movement, or be it climate change, if there's a congregation that cares deeply about something and that is in their DNA, the innovation has authenticity. And young adults are magnetically drawn to authenticity. That is something we see in the research again and again. If it's not authentic, they have very good detectors of that, and they'll run the other way. So all of this is to say, this is why our Innovation Hub began with Holy Listening as foundational. This is why we encourage you to practice Holy Listening with young people in your congregations. We have one concluding point, and then I'm going to give you our definition of Christian innovation and allow Gina to speak back to that. So the concluding point for us is that authentic Christian innovation with young adults is the church's work in each generation. It is the church living out loud through acts similar to those the church has always performed from the earliest record in the book of Acts. And our definition of Christian innovation is this. Christian innovation is bringing the healing power of Christian community to specific pain points in the world through reclaiming and reimagining ancient practices. Gina, what do you think about that?
I definitely think that is what's going on and what young adults are up to. I believe that, especially when you talk about brunch and how it really is important to us, whether we go before church or after church or skip church altogether and just get together with our friends, it is a time to engage in community. And I can say, like, from experience, that we have engaged the 5 points of the curriculum of the church that Maria Harris talks about within our conversations, whether it's like meeting the need of a friend or talking about the injustice or ways in which we want to bring about justice in the world. I do believe that young adults are doing this work, although it may not look like the conventional ways in which the church is doing it. It's still happening, and it's still very meaningful, not only to us, but to the world.
I'm typing out your comments from Maria Harris into the chat. Priestly listening, prophetic speech, and political advocacy. Those are helpful because we tend to say that church should not be political, right? We tend to be very hesitant about prophetic speech because we like to be nice to each other at church. We like to not cause too much agitation, right? And priestly listening, I just think that it's something that's rare these days for young people to actually be listened to, and for that matter, for anyone of any age to be listened to. So that is why I have shared with you all the Holy Listening Guide to Holy Listening. And what you have there is a few quotes that kind of set up an exercise that I have used in multiple different kinds of settings. I've used it actually in the middle of a sermon on Sunday morning. I've used it in the fellowship hall on a Valentine's Day lunch when the church is gathered. And it's such a simple thing. We invite people to get into pairs. If it's an intergenerational group, I invite them to pair up with someone who's at least a decade different in age from them. If it's a multiracial or multi-ethnic group, I ask them to engage with someone who doesn't look like they came from the same part, whose ancestors didn't come from the same part of the world as them. So we're diversifying the group, and then we just ask a simple prompt similar to the ones that we asked for your journaling here. Tell a story about a time when you saw a church responding to a pain point in the world, or tell a story about a pain point in your world. It can be as simple as that. One person has a chance to speak while the other person does nothing but listen. Listen as though they're expecting God to be incarnated through the person they are listening to. And then we switch roles and we take turns. And that exercise never fails to create a bond, to create an experience, to shift the energy in the room in a way that acknowledges that everybody has holy yearnings and that we are all equipped in one way or another to help accompany one another to to finding the quest, to finding what it is that we are yearning for. So, questions? Conversation? Ideas? And we have a few questions to guide that if nothing pops up on the screen. And Gina, I'll let you take that if nothing pops up here soon.
You know what, I don't have any questions coming up, but feel free to use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Don't be shy.
I'm really curious from the audience out there, if when you think about innovation in your congregation, any of these five um, curricula of the church that Maria Harris lifts up, does anything come to mind if you were to think about innovating around koinonia? If you were to think about innovating around liturgy, be it the public liturgy or the private contemplative practices? Do any of those frameworks help you think about what might be the holy yearnings of young adults in your setting? This is also, I always say this is conversations, questions, and cuss words. Did something we say, did something either of us said, is there something you want to push back? Is there some kind of place where it's not sitting well with you? We welcome those cuss words. I call them conversations, questions, any place that it became uncomfortable for you. Some of the challenges you might face in your setting as you try to innovate. So the last question, I just said I was going to let you lead this, Gina, and then I've done it. Do you want to offer that last question, please?
Sure. One more time. What are the ways in which your congregation might innovate or already be innovating with these five areas of curriculum that Maria Harris proposed? Koinonia, which is community or breaking bread together. Kerygma, which is the word. Didache, which is teaching. Liturgia, which is liturgy or the work of the people. And then finally, diaconia, which is service. And it looks like we have someone who has chimed in, maybe El Barto, I guess, says struggles this person faces while trying to innovate is keeping happy the institution while also having energy to do new things. And that is a true reality. I can definitely empathize with you as a person who works as a young adult minister. We are actually about to try to engage koinonia in a very radical way for the church, which is to have Bible study with wine at the church. And we're calling it Wine and Word. And there are several stewards who are a little concerned that it is something that ought not be done. But the reality is we're doing it anyway, whether we're in the church or not. So why not be a place that facilitates an opportunity for young adults to do what we already enjoy doing? Like, it's a part of our culture, but it's also a very meaningful moment in time for us. It seems like we have another person who has entered a chat that says, if I remember earlier, you described liturgia as the work or actions of the people. I think there's a deep longing to focus around this. Amen. It seems like my congregation has very much had a consumer model for a long time. Clergy provided, laity consumed. Wow. Young adults in our community want their voices to be heard, their actions and causes celebrated and supported. There's an anti-consumer desire and desire to co-create and co-conspire, to be the church and not just go to church. Do you have any thoughts about that, Dory?
Well, I got goosebumps as you were reading it. So goosebumps to me are a sign of the Holy Spirit. I don't know about y'all. They're a pretty true guide in my life. I think that just resounds so completely with what we heard the young adults in our studies say. And that's why we did that tricky thing of paying congregational fellows, paying young people who were already spiritual and religious to go out and listen to their peers who were spiritual and maybe not religious, not participating in organized religion, because it gave them agency to be the church and not just go to church. So, those young adults who were that first round of holy listeners really have launched incredible ideas in those congregations. So yes, how do we give the work away? I always thought the best ministers, the best clergy are the people who know how to do a hospital visit with great compassion and care, and then give the work away, teach others how to do that, right? It's about giving the work away, even the preaching work and the teaching work and the youth facilitation, all of those roles, the better we get at giving them away and allowing young people to design projects, programs, new ways of being church, and give them the reins, the more we have a chance at meeting them. I think that the subtitle to this was Finding Our Way to Young Adults. What can we do to find our way? And I think, Anna, you have a pretty good hunch about that. Others, what do you think? I think there's probably some cultural differences here. Like some churches in some pockets might be more passive, and others might be more, young adults might be more expected to be more passive rather than active agents. Some cultures more than others.
This is Martha. I'm going to hop in here. If anybody else has additional questions, they can feel free to email them to connectional.learning@garrett.edu. connectional.learning@garrett.edu. Because we are coming to the end of our time, and if there are questions, additional comments that you have, I will certainly forward them to Dory and Gina for their comments.
Martha, you might also just want to revisit the slides at the very beginning, 2 and 3, so that you can share our contact information, because people are welcome also to email us directly with questions or comments.
All right, we will certainly do that, and I invite you and Gina, if you have any final comments, now would be the time if you want to.
Well, I will just close by saying I don't know who you are out there. I know we have a few of you. I wish I could have seen your faces, but it's been a joy to share this work with you. And stay tuned. There's more webinars coming up, and we will be meeting later in October with the congregations and their prototypes. We'll be having poster sessions where they're each bringing some of their learnings to share with us. So there will be a round 2 of a report that comes out of this project that will be published in March of next year, and will give a little bit more insights into what the churches actually did. Seeing one more comment here. It says, I sadly was not able to attend the first session, so this may have been covered. The examples and focus of the project seems to be urban/suburban. Was there any effort made to engage in rural congregational or cultural settings? To be honest, there seems to be a significant gap in the presence of young people in many of these settings. I suspect due to a lack of opportunity here, so perhaps it isn't relevant. Well, Heather, I want to tell you that your question is relevant. Our research design was specific to the Chicagoland area, and we did stay within that urban and suburban cohort because we were particularly interested in what was going on there. But I can honestly say that a similar kind of holy listening approach in rural areas would turn up interesting and different themes. And I really would support that work. I agree that it needs to be done. And I think some of the congregational learning that Garrett is doing is specific to rural areas, but we did not have that as part of our project. So thanks for that question. Gina, do you have anything about that?
Nothing in particular. I happen to be from a rural community, but I am also wondering what's going on there with young adults, as many of us who grew up in rural areas. Like I grew up on a farm in Georgia, and once I graduated high school, I moved to Atlanta to go to college. So I kind of left the home base to spread my wings and to honestly engage more opportunity just to grow as an adult. But that does not mean that there are not young people and young adults in those congregations. So I definitely see that as an opportunity to do more research or to do another phase of this project to see what is actually taking place in those rural areas.
All right, thank you so much. Thank you to all of our participants. I want to remind you that we will be meeting same time next week, 11 a.m. Central Time, and look for your reminders with the link on how to do that. I want to thank you to Dr. Dory Baker, and as she pointed out, PhD student and millennial, Gina Robinson. Thank you so much for your presentation, and thank you again to our audience for your participation.
It was good to be with you all. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.